Hello and welcome to this special interview where we shall be talking a bit about Napoleon today, and I am joined by the masterful Apostolic Majesty. How are you, sir?
Hello, Beau. It's lovely to be here in person for the first time.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to, I think, both you and I, just a few minutes before this, that this is taking place on Bastille Day, so all the more appropriate, or at least it's going to be recorded on Bastille Day.
Right, yeah. It's great to have you in. I don't think it's needless sycophancy to say I've very rarely ever known, let alone met someone with your depth of knowledge. So it's always a pleasure to pick your brain, it really is. So today we thought we'd talk about the question, was Napoleon good for France? That's what you thought would be an interesting topic of discussion.
I did indeed. And the reason I think it's a very important question, and to again emphasize France specifically, is that so much of the Napoleonic myth, I guess, and the whole notion of grandeur, Gaullist grandeur, is wrapped up in the association that France has, you can say, the natural right to be the great leader of Europe in more ways than one, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of military might and glory, etc. And no figure ostensibly would seem to epitomize that more so than Napoleon le Grand, Napoleon the Great, the man who at one point conquered Europe and then lost it all within the space of a couple of years. And my contention here, looking at Napoleon, is that I believe this is a man who was given so many opportunities to build for France an unassailable legacy, not just in territory, but in terms of culture and his economy and his ability to trade and dominate European markets. And several years ago, I came to the conclusion that Napoleon had bungled that opportunity. And he had bungled it in a way that was so decisive that I believe it left France almost bordering on second-tier nation status forevermore. And when you look at a politician like de Gaulle, it seems that the whole notion of grandeur is in many ways a sense of overcompensating for that loss.
It's interesting. It's interesting to talk about, just in the broadest sense, the sweep of history, sort of the Gallic grandeur that you talk about, going back to sort of the Franks and Charlemagne and 1,000 years before, almost.
Indeed. Well, you can almost look at this and say that the way I try and structure history, I mean, in deference to your Epoch show, I try to see history in terms of broad parallels, not broad in the sense that these are nebulous by any means, not at all. But you can say that modern France was formed of Clovis, even though there is a train of thought that puts it further to Vercingetorix and the Gauls. But when you look at someone like Clovis, you look at the Merovingians, and then they coalesce into the Carolingians. Under someone like Charlemagne, who is really not just the founder of France as a nation, but also the founder of Germany as a nation as well. It seems that the whole notion of the Franks and that ability to dominate Europe and assume the mantle of Caesarian rulership, the restoration of the Roman Empire, is not enough that Charlemagne was able to assume that dominant position within Europe during the 9th century, but he was also emperor. It seems that what I see with Napoleon is there is so much conscious historical reenactment in a figure like Napoleon. Napoleon begins as a man with so much, I would say, promise in terms of all the goodwill that had been bestowed upon a particular tumultuous time within French history. And then he aspires to this Carolingian restoration, almost directly 1,000 years after the original Charlemagne. Except unlike Charlemagne, there isn't this glorious French epoch of a new Holy Roman Empire that's born out of it. Instead, ultimately, the 19th century in European history is very much the tale of how Germany came to surpass France. All the more ironic because I believe that German nationalism, as we understand it in the 19th century, is impossible without a figure like Napoleon. In many ways, you can say that Napoleon does more to benefit Germany and even Italy in the long run than he does for France.
And Britain.
Indeed Britain, of course.
Yeah. So that's one of the first things, when you mentioned this to me a week or so ago, that we would talk about this, my first gut reaction, or the first an instant in my mind is, no, Napoleon was terrible for France. absolute terrible, a disaster, a catastrophe for France. But then the more I've sort of mulled it over and thought about it, although I still think that if I had to pick one side of the ledger or the other, I would pick bad, negative. But there are certainly positives. I think you admit there must be some. And although our question is specific, was he good for France? The thing I kept coming back to was, if it wasn't for Napoleon and then the Battle of the Nile and Trafalgar, Britain wouldn't have, I know it's not within the purview of our question, but as an aside, Britain wouldn't have dominated, I wouldn't have thought, it during the 19th century as hard as it did if we hadn't had the opportunity to annihilate the French Navy. That's a fair thing to say, do you think?
It is, interestingly. But I suppose that question then becomes, you have taken the question, was Napoleon good for France? And you have said, inevitably, he was good for all of France's neighbours, especially Britain. I think it might be instructive for those listening just to have a brief overview, because I don't want to get ahead and assume that everyone knows everything about Napoleon. So just to give a very brief trajectory of what he did. The French Revolution happens in 1789. It becomes more radical, and the French ruling family are deposed, and then they are executed as a result of the guillotine. The French Revolution mutates into a feverishly zealous epoch during Maximilien Robespierre called the Reign of Terror, where it begins killing off basically the own proponents of the revolution, such as prominently Danton and the Hepatists. And then there is a period, you can say, of trying to moderate the worst excesses of the revolution, following the revolutionary zeal that eventually leads to the execution of those who incited it, Saint-Just and Robespierre himself. And then you have a figure like Napoleon. Napoleon is basically entering into a political vacuum, which is caused by this period of moderation called the Directory. He is very young. He is a young Corsican minor noble, and he quickly demonstrates his military brilliance in evicting the British from the French naval port of Toulon. He then goes on to counter a Royalist insurrection in 1795, and that gives him command of an army in Italy. What Napoleon does is turn Italy from a sideshow in the overall war of the coalition powers against France, trying to cancel out the French Revolution, and he makes Italy the decisive frontier during the war, which was previously Germany. He wins a series of battles, such as Lodi, and he's able to impose on his main adversary, Austria, a peace basically by his own volition. And what that does is basically demonstrate that the Directory and the French political system can't really deal with someone who is as ambitious and as determined to rise to the heights of his own predestined star as Napoleon. And so Napoleon very much seems to be determining French foreign policy as well as military strategy. He then goes on, he conquers Egypt briefly, goes off into Syria, and then his navy is decisively defeated, as you mentioned, at the Battle of the Nile, causing him to abandon his army, then turn back. But again, a man who was never shy to spin all of these military setbacks in the best possible light. The conquest of Egypt becomes this great Oriental expedition. It's the birth of Egyptology, and it is French science that is conquered, even though French armies have been left stranded here. And so he becomes the sword of a conspiracy to upend this French political system, led by other great French revolutionaries such as Sieyès, who wrote What is the Third Estate, one of the most famous pre-revolutionary pamphlets. Ultimately, he's able to sideline all of these people who thought they could use Napoleon. He establishes a personal dictatorship called the Consulate, and then he moves on essentially to become embroiled in a series of wars with all of the neighbouring powers. He fights off Britain, he fights off Austria, wins a battle at Marengo, and then he assumes to himself the power of an emperor, more so than that being a consul. And he justifies it essentially by saying that I am going to be Caesarian, it's a republican office. You know, the last time I think you and I discussed history, we talked about the Emperor Augustus. Well, again, as so much of Napoleon's history was conscious historical reenactment, so too he was assuming the office of Augustus, and he was having the Pope there to officiate over the proceedings and bless this new recreation of a Carolingian empire. You can say at the beginning there were these overtly republican affectations, but eventually they became dynastic, absolutist, monarchical, and ultimately you can say to the detriment of France. And so Napoleon goes off in the next few years and achieves some remarkable victories against the Austrians and the Russians at Austerlitz. He is able to win decisive victories against the Prussians with his Marshal Davout at Jena and the Battle of Auerstadt, defeats the Russians at Friedland, compels them to peace at Tilsit, and it seems that Napoleon's at the top of the world. Then Napoleon makes a series of unforced errors. You've already mentioned the Battle of Trafalgar. You can't really blame Napoleon for that because he wasn't leading the fleets, nor was he an admiral. But you can blame Napoleon for the after effects of that, which is that Napoleon believed, I cannot defeat Britain through a system of naval interdiction or by being able to overcome the maritime strength of the British Empire. So I'm going to cut off the lifeblood of the empire, which is trade, continental trade with Europe. And that is the birth of the continental system. Now, the horrible logic of the continental system for Napoleon is that it necessitated that Napoleon assume control of more and more and more facets, not just of European territory, but more of European political life. It leads him to what you can say to be his greatest disaster, which is the invasion of Portugal and by extension the invasion of Spain. It's not enough to depose his allies. The justification becomes more spurious. You are not efficient enough in enforcing the British naval blockade. And in that terms, he deposes his own relatives. He deposes his brother Louis, who had been made king of the Netherlands. He deposes his brother Jerome, who had been made king of Westphalia, out of the territories of Oldenburg and North Germany. At one point, France even has a border into the Baltic Sea with Denmark. And then, of course, the worst impulses of the continental system force Napoleon, by his own logic, to invade Russia, to compel Russia to come back and become part of this continental system. And after, we all know, Napoleon was defeated in Russia, what does Napoleon do? Does Napoleon try and make peace? Does Napoleon try to lessen his ambitions as a result of the continental system? No. He continues to fight. And even though he has an advocate in one of his former enemies in the form of Metternich in Austria, he keeps on fighting. And ultimately, he loses everything, is deposed, and is reduced merely to the emperor of the island of Elba. And then, when he believes there's tumult among the Allies and unrest in France, he comes back and leads one of the most bizarre periods in French history, which is the 100 Days Campaign, which, of course, we all know as culminating in the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon is defeated by Wellington. Thereafter, he is sent off to St. Helena and he dies there in exile.
I mean, I feel like I absolutely agree with you that he messed up, he dropped the ball, however you want to say it, that he led himself to Elba and then St. Helena in all sorts of ways. It's like he had his destiny in his own hands. He made unforced errors, you said. Yeah, the deposing of the Spanish royal family, in hindsight anyway, it's easy to say these things, isn't it, in hindsight?
I don't think it is, actually. I think, I mean, that's, another sort of comparison is like, why did Hitler invade the Soviet Union in 1941? You can say in hindsight, why did he do that? He obviously lost. But no, I think it's not with the benefit of hindsight. I think it's the result of hubris, fundamentally, that made him, forced him into a decision which was so ultimately detrimental, and not just detrimental in terms of his own strategic picture and that of the legacy of France. It was a betrayal in terms of his own alliances, his own ability to show that he can cooperate with people. I mean, let me just again emphasize why I believe there is so much hope in a figure like Napoleon. After the disasters of the worst excesses of the French Revolution, where France was basically in a totalitarianism as a concept is rather anachronistic to the 18th century, but especially Paris becomes a political hellscape during the year 1793, 1794. And the Directory, you can say, is a very weak attempt to lessen the worst excesses that have come out as a result of that. You have the stabilization of the currency, the replacement of the assignat with the franc, the creation of 5 directors who were supposed to moderate one another in terms of the overall headship of France. You had the creation of a a new legislature, the Council of the 500, which is supposed to be more conservative than the preceding legislature, which was the National Convention. And then you enter into that Napoleon. The problem with the Directory is that most of its members, frankly, were corrupt. And in a war, I think it's fair to say that what one needs is undivided command. And so therefore it's natural that someone as ambitious and certain in his own veritas, the truth of his actions, is going to ultimately sideline an institution like the Directory, which ultimately he does. He's going to impose peace treaties of his own volition, like we see with the Austrians in 1797. So therefore, it's only natural that so many French politicians looked to Napoleon and the ambitious young general and said, this is a man that can stabilize any regime in the future because he is popular, he is shown to be successful, and he has that ambition, you can say again, to ensure the greatness of France. Everything you want, ostensibly, from a leader. So after the coup of Brumaire, Napoleon, as I mentioned, completely sidelines those who believe that they could control him. But I think it's important to emphasize that Napoleon, from the outset, during the consulate period, demonstrated that he was capable of working with people. So, for example, one of the great successes of Napoleonic politics were the successes of his foreign minister Talerand, who is a nefarious mainstay in French political culture, right from the beginning of the French Revolution, where he's the one demanding the nationalization of monastic property, all the way up until the 1830s.
Right, so he outlives Napoleon and still continues on in
exactly.
incredible life.
Yes, he's an influential figure in the Orleanist government long after Napoleon. You know, a mainstay in French politics for 50 years, effectively. But under a figure like Talleyrand, the French revolutionary government demonstrates that it is able to moderate its ambitions. It's not solely determined in overthrowing all of Europe's monarchs and imposing the legacy of the French Revolution, like all the precepts of the rights of man, etc., onto Europe by right of force. Talleyrand is able to, say, for example, use an alliance with Spain in order to shore up France's position in Italy, which is pivotal, given that Napoleon himself had come to power by shaping the power balance in Italy itself. And then you have a process known as the mediatizations, whereby Napoleon and Talleyrand were able basically to use the greed of the Russian Tsar, Alexander, to carve up large sections of Germany and compensate various princes, whilst giving France vast amounts of territory on the left bank of the Rhine. If anything was to doom the Holy Roman Empire, it was Tsar Alexander and Napoleon carving up the empire during the mediatizations several years before the formal end of the Holy Roman Empire. So, as you can probably see, this demonstrates again that Napoleon is willing to concede points of foreign policy to a very able minister in the form of Talleyrand. He is also able to moderate the anti-clerical nature of the French Revolution. So, as a result of the French Revolution, the religious calendar, the 7-day week, had been abolished, and France had decided to assume decimal time, which is the décade, the 10-day week, and the Republican celebrations in lieu of All Saints' Days and religious celebrations. And of course, the abolition of things like Sunday was seen as pivotal in terms of being able to de-Christianize France. Napoleon does away with all of that, something the Directory have been unable to do. And what he then goes on to do is negotiate with the Pope a concordat, which not only normalizes the political relations with the papacy in Italy, because the papacy was still a major political power in Italy at that point, but it also ensures that France is seen to be a Catholic power in the style of its Gallican forebears, like King Francis or King Louis XIV, who were determined to assume that the French political system had ultimate power over the appointment of bishops, not the destruction of Christianity within France itself, as had been the raison d'etre of the revolution. So then, you can say a major moderating achievement of a strong man such as Napoleon. And then you brought up the example of the destruction of the British fleet at the Battle of the Nile. This culminates in the Peace of Amiens, whereby France and Britain are at peace. All of a sudden, it would seem that Napoleon has done the impossible And after only a few years of coming in and winning his decisive victory at Marengo, he is able to bring peace to France after having already stabilized the internal situation in France, tried basically to undermine the French Royalist insurrection in the Vendée and the chouannerie in Brittany and places like that. And if you look at the terms of the Peace of Amiens, Britain actually was prepared to concede a lot to France for the sake of winning that peace. So, for example, the areas that Britain had occupied, which were part of the Dutch or the Batavian Republic, which was now a French client, like Cape Town in particular, the Cape Colony, modern-day South Africa, was returned to the Netherlands. Areas like Malta, which had been occupied after Napoleon's expedition, where he had temporarily annexed it only for the British to come in and then annex Malta. Malta was to be restored back to the Knights Hospitaller. Britain was prepared to allow French Louisiana to come back into existence. All of these things, which you can say would go well to normalize relations with Britain. But again, this is where Napoleon, in his desire basically already from the beginning to establish a de facto continental system where France has the overriding interest in the continent, he cannot understand how Britain can have any interests in the continent now that peace has been achieved, despite the fact that at the time, the King of Great Britain was also the Elector of Hanover, and so was actually one of the great European sovereigns and holding a large section of Germany, which was only comparable to places like Bavaria and Prussia itself. And indeed, of course, the notion that why on earth would Britain tolerate a power which has consolidated control over the entirety of the continent, thereby placing Britain in a position of existential turmoil, which has been basically Britain's policy since the War of the Spanish Succession 100 years before. So Napoleon takes that peace and he goes a little bit further and decides, I'm going to annex Switzerland. I'm going to turn it into a client state, the Helvetic Republic. Even though, and this is something which is really important to understand, when Talerand was negotiating the Treaty of Lunéville with Austria and the Treaty of Amiens with Britain, he privately came to the conclusion that this is the summit of achievable French power within the bounds of peace. That being, France has achieved what it wanted in the Napoleonic and the Revolutionary Wars, a new border where France was protected on all sides by natural frontiers. The Pyrenees in the south against Spain, the Alps in the east against Italy, the Rhine in the north against Germany. And again, you're looking at this in terms of legacy. You're looking at this in terms of German nationalism, French control over Belgium, over the left bank of the Rhine, and potentially over areas like the Ruhr Valley and the city of Mayence or Mainz in German. You can understand that had France been able to achieve control over these natural borders, French domination of Europe would have been assured up until probably this day, given the wealth of those territories and the impetus they gave towards Prussian and later German industrialization. So Talleyrand understands this, and he understands that any further steps will inevitably lead to a renewal of hostilities. But Napoleon can't help himself. So as I mentioned, he annexes the Helvetic Republic. And that's also another point. The French revolutionaries, in terms of historical reenactment, were obsessed with renaming historic polities and giving them Roman-era names. So obviously, you'll be familiar, it's not enough to be Switzerland, one needs to be Helvetia after the Helvetii, in the same way that it's not enough to be the Netherlands, one needs to be Batavia after the original Batavians. There is the Cisalpine Republic, which of course Cisalpine Gaul. They even tried to rename the Neapolitan state at one point to a name which is so obscure that it's left me. But nevertheless, it sort of demonstrates that the French took this process of neoclassical reenactment very seriously. And they eventually annexed the territories of Piedmont, which threw up the whole situation in Italy and also put France on another collision course with Austria as well. There are also, you can say, a series of attempts by the Royalists. The Royalists basically assumed that with the Directory in charge, they would come back into power. But Napoleon has basically undermined the Royalist program by doing a lot of what the Royalists wanted, essentially. And so there was a Royalist plot to assassinate Napoleon. And that again leads Napoleon down a very dark track where he begins to assume consular authority for 10 years. And then he assumes consular authority for life. And he does this through a series of popular plebiscites. But eventually, the Royalist antipathy towards Napoleon, the fact that they will never recognize him, despite the fact he's appealing to the Catholic Church, and he's appealing to, you can say, normalization of relations because he is the usurper. He is not the rightful king of France. The rightful king of France is Louis XVIII, who is still in exile at this time, leads him to the murder of the Duke of Enghien, who is a scion of the House of Bourbon, in fact, specifically is a member of the French House of Condé. And what that does is undo all of the goodwill that Napoleon and Talleyrand have built up among the European powers in terms of the mediatizations, the policies towards Italy and Spain, the policies towards the papacy. It's not enough that Britain feels imperiled by the fact that Napoleon is willfully annexing more territory in Europe and showing complete contempt for, say, for example, the British right to hold on to Hanover, which is the dynastic possession of the British monarchy. Napoleon goes a step further. He tries to reconquer Haiti, which had been taken over during the Haitian Revolution. And what that means is right before Britain had abolished the slave trade, Britain was now faced with a major competitor in the sugar trade in the Caribbean. Again, you can say that if you are thinking more in terms of long-term policy and lasting peace, you won't imperil Britain on so many fronts simultaneously, which ultimately is what forces Britain to make a very risky step, which is the renewal of hostilities, because the British understand that going to war against France again basically means that they will lose Hanover, perhaps indefinitely, and they do up until the Restoration back in 1814, 1815. Because you have to understand that with the experience in Egypt, as we've gone over, and the experience in Haiti, and the experience in Louisiana, it seems that Napoleon is actually focusing more on anti-colonial policy as much as he is in terms of consolidating European power at the same time. But the Duke of Enghien's assassination by Napoleon, which even, I believe, Josephine Bonaparte was determined to avoid, because even she knew the ramifications of doing so, was enough to basically give the impression to Europe's ruling elite, the Austrian emperor, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, the King of Prussia, albeit that will be slightly later, but certainly the Tsar of Russia, that Napoleon was just a Jacobite menace. And ultimately, you can say in many ways he was. He was a Jacobite revolutionary emperor who showed ultimately no respect for any country other than the revolutionary manifestation of the French Republic, later the Empire, which again comes back to your point about the Spanish incident being, we can say that in hindsight, it was a bad decision. No, I think it's a culmination. It's a culmination of bad decisions whereby Napoleon assumes his own aura of Caesarian infallibility. I am Caesar and Caesar can do no wrong. And thereby all of these puffed up, corpulent princes that I have to deal with, if I remove them willy-nilly, then of course the peoples of Europe will love me. They will come to embrace me. I will impose upon them the Code Napoleon. I will give them equality before the law. I will give them rights and prosperity. He doesn't seem to understand that having those rights imposed don't seem to be so much as a blessing, so much as a foreign imposition and indeed a symptom of conquest. And again, that comes back to Napoleon. Despite all of these moderating influences that I mentioned during the consulate, ultimately Napoleon is a scion of the revolution and the scion of the Jacobin element of the revolutionaries, whereby the precepts of the French Revolution are ultimately infallible. And so it is only logical that as the French Revolution expands across Europe, the peoples of Europe, breaking out of the shackles of the chains of feudalism, basically is how Napoleon would see it, will come to embrace l'Empereur, Napoleon, as this new modern Carolingian restoration.
It's funny, isn't it? What an odd thing is, because it's not just to have a Jacobin emperor, right? What an odd thing if you'd gone to the Jacobin club and said one of your number one day will be an emperor. They would have, I don't know, scoffed, laughed, been incredulous. I don't know. Anyway, that's an aside. So keeping our eye on the prize of was Napoleon good for France? You've mentioned loads of things there that on both sides of the ledger, good things for France and terrible things for France. One of the first things, if we could try and go through it a little bit chronologically, one of the first things where I questioned my own gut reaction of saying, no, Napoleon's terrible for France. One of the first things where I thought to myself, oh no, wait, that was surely good though for France, was when the terror ends, or when Napoleon's brought into Paris to put down a mob in Paris, you know, the whiff of grape shot, that moment. That's surely good for France. I mean, not good for the people that got massacred that day. But that's good for France, isn't it? That it draws a line under the worst violent mob excesses of the Parisians.
Who were the mob?
Well, okay, sure. Well,
They
they
were
were pro-royalists.
They were
weren't they?
pro-royalist.
But still,
What Napoleon was doing, he was defending the Republic at any means necessary, effectively. That underpins, you can say, so much of what I would call his own inherent radicalism throughout the first sort of 10 years from 1795, when that incident happened, up until his assumption of the imperial office, the office of France.
and was that 1804?
1804, December the 4th.
So like 9 years later.
9 years later. Yeah. I believe that what Napoleon basically did, like I said, there was so much opportunities that Napoleon had, because the obvious alternative to Napoleon was a restoration of royal power. And in that incident, all of the moderating influences against the revolution would have happened the same way, effectively, that they occurred under Napoleon. What Napoleon was able to bring to the new government right from the onset with the Battle of Marengo was a strengthened territorial position within Europe, because Napoleon was not so fussed, say, for example, about the ancient land rights of the various German holders on the left bank of the Rhine, or the Austrian Empire in the Netherlands. It was one of the reasons why Louis XVIII became so unpopular when he came back in 1814, was that he was seen as giving away that patrimony, basically, of France. My contention has been that Napoleon had achieved that patrimony and then seemed to do everything in his power subsequently to alienate that patrimony from France, having basically already achieved France's best possible result very early on by providing that leadership and, you can say, a necessary conservative revolt against his predecessors in order to ensure some form of peaceful, stable regime. And again, you can say that there is a part of many European leaders that would still, of course, have preferred that the royalty come back. Mm-hmm. Louis XVIII becomes king again, which of course was the overarching question which concerned Napoleon during those days and compelled him, he believed, the necessity of assuming to himself more grandiose offices like that of the Emperor of France, or the Emperor of the French. Part of the reason he assumed that office was the assumption of equality with his European neighbours. But of course it has the opposite effect, because it's not equality, clearly, that what Napoleon is seeking or is interpreted by, say, for example, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Emperor of Austria. It is to be supplanted by Napoleon. You know, this...
They still see him as an upstart, regardless of wearing...
Of course they do, because this is might makes right. This is, I found the throne, the crown of France in the gutter, and I picked it up with my sword. It's just... You know, he who was made essentially by military might could be unmade by military might. And effectively that is what the European leaders see him as, and ultimately that is how he is treated. What I find remarkable about Napoleon is all of the opportunities where he could have stabilized a political system with himself as the emperor, effectively, or indeed as the consul. Mm-hmm. And he seems to surrender all of those opportunities. And again, we're not even talking about the betrayal of the French Revolution as an angle, because we're ultimately talking about what is good for France, not what is good for the legacy of the French Revolution. We're not going to talk about Marxist critiques about Bonapartism and aspects of that, and the fear of some sort of military leader taking control of France. I actually want to turn it on its head and say that actually applies more to Napoleon as much as anyone else. because Napoleon suffers from this great loss of legitimacy from the beginning due to the fact that he took power in a military coup against the revolution, and then he continues on in that vein by justifying the control of the Bonapartes all across Europe by simply taking away the thrones of other people like King Ferdinand of Spain and giving it to Joseph and giving it to his older brother Joseph. What is interesting is that as Napoleon is aware that he is a usurper to the other European royals, in many ways he is also a usurper to the French political establishment domestically. Napoleon has to own France's military glory in a way that compels him to go out and personally lead all these campaigns, which during this time really should have been delegated to other generals. Why can't Napoleon delegate power to generals? Because Napoleon assumed power by able to bypass the French government through his monopolization of foreign policy and strategy, so he couldn't allow anyone else to do that. I mentioned Marengo. The decisive battle during the War of the Second Coalition, which was that victory which leads to the first peace that I mentioned, was not Marengo, it was the Battle of Hohenlinden. It was commanded by General Jean Moreau. And the effect of that basically meant that Napoleon had an obvious rival for political power. In the same way that Napoleon had assumed power because of his military excellence, why not, before it would have been someone like a Desailles, but now it's a Moreau. Why could he not assume political power in France? And so inevitably that means that Moreau is forming his own salons, and eventually he is exiled from France because there cannot be a military competitor. In the same way that France ennobles so many of its generals and they become marshals of the empire, what do so many of them do? Soult, for example, wants to supplant Joseph as King of Spain. What does Jean Bernadotte do? He goes off and becomes King of Sweden. It's the same justification. You basically open the doors of hell, and all of a sudden any Tom, Dick, and Harry or whatever can become ruler of this and ruler of that. And so they are not just aspiring to overthrow Napoleon because he's a usurper, but these usurpers are in turn looking to Napoleon as an example. Why can't we overthrow Napoleon? I could be King of Sweden, Soult could be King of Spain. Why do we need this man? And so the logic, as I mentioned with the continental system, means more control. I can't rely on any of these upstarts, even though they're my own family, like Louis or Jerome, so I'm going to depose them. Thereby, there's this whole friction within the Napoleonic system, which is based essentially on this lack of legitimacy that Napoleon has. I mean, it should be mentioned the absurdity of having his older brother be the junior ruler within this coalition. From the point of view of primogeniture, again, it's nonsense, but such is the whole nature of the Napoleonic system.
During the period of the consuls?
No, during the period of Joseph being King of Spain.
Okay,
And,
all right, okay.
Yeah, Joseph was the older brother.
Oh, sorry, Lucien. Was Napoleon older than Lucian?
Yes, Napoleon was the second oldest brother. Lucien was the president of the Council of the 500 during the coup of Brumaire, and eventually he was one of the few brothers of Napoleon that would not receive a title, even though...
Can I just touch on that moment there? The Brumaire... what's it actually called?
The coup of Brumaire, I forget the exact date.
Yeah. That was another thing that pinged off in my mind when I thought, no, actually, that is good for France. Would you agree? When Napoleon and Lucien did that, did away with really quite a weak, I think already in this conversation you called it sort of a weak body.
Like I said,
to do away with that, surely that's in France's interest.
Like I said, I think the issue is, I have been looking at Napoleon as a series of lost opportunities for France. And this actually makes the whole conversation that much more frustrating. Because Napoleon, given the political situation of France at the time, this is 1799, the consulate was an improvement over all of the Republican governments that had preceded it.
Sure,
that's inevitable.
Absolutely.
But the point is Napoleon lost it. And the point is Napoleon didn't have to lose it. As I mentioned with Napoleon's original foreign policy that had achieved peace, but nevertheless the assassination of the Duke of Enghien and Britain's declaration of war precipitated the wars of the Third Coalition. Of course, Napoleon was lucky, and Napoleon won. You can say again, glorious, that's great for France. But again, it just demonstrates a pattern Napoleon can only survive so long as he continues to
that's the
obtain
key.
military victories. I mean, if you look at the War of the Third Coalition, you know, there's no reason essentially why Napoleon should have won that war. Napoleon starts off with his camp at Boulogne, trying to invade Britain, and then the Russians and the Austrians have arrived in the heart of Europe. There is a famous error. I'm not sure whether to corroborate this or not, but the old logic is that the army of Kutuzov and the army of von Mack at Ulm didn't coordinate their efforts because the Russians were using the old Russian calendar rather than the modern Julian calendar. But nevertheless, Napoleon is able to win a decisive victory unexpectedly. In the same way that we see the War of the Fifth Coalition against Austria, Napoleon could have very easily lost that war. Ultimately, the saving grace was that Austria attacked prematurely. But Napoleon had invaded Spain, and he had created a situation essentially where he had forced himself to apply garrisons where he didn't have to before. The Austrians took the opportunity, and they actually inflicted upon him his first decisive defeat in a decade at the Battle of Essling. And Napoleon was only able to reprieve himself at the Battle of Wagram. And by this time, it should be noted, at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon had the benefit of having tactical innovations over the other coalition powers. The levy en masse, which wasn't a Napoleonic innovation, it was an innovation of Les Acanaux during the height of the French Revolution. The benefit of the levy en masse basically meant that France could assume the mantle of dividing armies into corps, you know, march divided, fight concentrated, as they achieved at the Battle of Ulm, encircling the Austrian army and destroying it, ensuring that you have more manpower at any one given time in order to commit to a battle, which is very important. But when you get to somewhere like Wagram, the Austrians are imitating Napoleon. They're able to assume one of the largest armies in the history of the Austrian Empire at that point. Yeah, we're talking about, you know, battles in the 1790s from 20,000, now 80,000, 100,000. At Borodino, we're talking about nearly, 400,000 combatants at the Battle of Borodino against Russia, perhaps more. I don't have the exact numbers at my disposal.
Wagram's one of the biggest battles that most people, even Napoleon nerds, might not know anything about.
Indeed.
But right, it's a giant battle though, wasn't it?
And of course, then we have Leipzig, you know, the Battle of the Nations. We're talking about, you know,
hundreds of thousands,
over 500,000 men.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're talking, this is again, you can say the necessity of Napoleon's constant need to achieve power and consolidation of power through conquest due to the fundamental lack of legitimacy and due to the fact that he has decided to own the basis of General Bonaparte, basically overriding anything. It creates an atmosphere in Europe of the mobilization of popular armies, you know, whether it be the Landeswehr in Prussia, the creation of new vast, you know, national militias, which didn't really exist before, the use of nationalism as a tool to be used against French aggrandizement. All of these things that were inconceivable a decade or a little bit before then are now coming to the fore. The very forces of the bourgeois French Revolution, the consolidation of the unitary state in France, the creation of the département, the levy en masse, all of these things are now being used by Napoleonic adversaries against Napoleon himself. And so the nature of total war and total conquest inevitably reverberates on Napoleon. And so, you know, go to Prussia, you know, what was the great sort of saving grace for Prussia during the 19th century? The old army of Frederick the Great had been able to, you know, lapse in stagnation without being tested effectively. And then you have the geniuses of Gneisenau and Scharnhorst coming to radically transform the Prussian state, which would become the basis of great power Prussia for the 19th century. In the same way that I can look at 1809 and say it was Austria's great lost opportunity to establish a German empire under Austrian auspices. All of these things were effectively very near misses. But of course, Napoleon then commits himself to the disastrous strategy of invading Russia, ostensibly to force Russia to be France's ally again in the continental system. And of course, because that's such a bizarre notion, Napoleon ultimately has to lean on other causes, like expanding Poland. I'm going to lob off the Lithuanian and the Ukrainian parts of Russia, and I'm going to award them back to Poland. Of course, the Russians aren't going to be very happy with that, and they're going to be compelled to be an ally again. So you can almost forgive all of this, all of these military blunders, the intensification of warfare, the deaths of millions of people, which we're seeing carnage which wasn't seen really since the 30 Years' War, during which most people died of diseases and consumption. Of course, that's also the case in the Napoleonic Wars before the advent of modern military medicine. But during 1813, I've often looked at, say, for example, the Frankfurt proposals. One of the great sort of diplomatic revolutions in the 19th century was when Metternich took power in Austria. Clemens von Metternich was a chancellor who came to dominate the post-war period to the point it was known as the Metternichian system. He was basically the host of the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. But Metternich came to power on the basis basically of acting as Austria's Kissinger, and he was going to appease Napoleon, a form of rapprochement, and bring Napoleon into the European political system, normalize the fact that he'd be an emperor, and give him a Habsburg princess in the form of Mary Louise. And so there was a lot riding, you can say, on Austria and its policy of détente towards France in terms of using Napoleon as a necessary bulwark against other major adversaries, whether it be Prussia or whether it be Russia. But Napoleon, during 1813, showed that he had no interest in peace. He only had interest in ensuring temporary ceasefires for which he could remobilize his forces, conscript more young boys into the army, and attain a turnaround from which he could then defeat his opponents. And when Napoleon rejected the Frankfurt proposals by Metternich, which were basically, you could say, the restoration of France on her 1802 boundaries.
He absolutely should have accepted that.
Absolutely.
It was crazy not to.
Given the situation.
Right.
And again, you can almost say that this actually speaks to something more regarding the whole notion of Napoleon was good to France. I don't associate Napoleon with France as much as a lot of other people do. Napoleon was born Napoleone Buonaparte, the Lion of Naples. His family, Carlo, the later Frenchified, who became the Corsican representative at the court of Versailles, Genoese extraction ruling over Corsica, which had then always been a Genoese colony for hundreds of years. It had been annexed by France in 1768. And what is fascinating is that Napoleon, I've discussed this elsewhere, but the logic of Napoleon's campaigns, because they were Carolingian, they focused more on areas like northern Italy and Western Germany and the Netherlands, more so than France itself. So Napoleon's whole political logic from the War of the Third Coalition onwards seemed to be holding on to places like Bavaria, annexing the Tyrol, say, for example, away from Austria, even the Illyrian provinces where France annexed the Dalmatian coast, and the Septinsular republics where France annexed the Greek islands, all of this sort of thing. Eventually, France would annex, as I mentioned, the Batavian kingdom and the north coast of Germany. It would also annex most of Italy. Indeed, Napoleon's desire was to live out the rest of his days in Rome, in the former palace of the popes. So the whole logic of this expanding France ultimately means that France as a concept in and of itself becomes diminished, because it simply becomes an element of a grander imperial superstructure. What ultimately does France become if Napoleon decides to become the emperor of Europe? France becomes the main purveyor of manpower to the system, in the same way, say, for example, that Castile did during the days of the Spanish Empire, which also, like the Napoleonic Empire, had a transnational dimension to it. So areas like northern Italy and Western Germany were more enamored of Napoleon than areas like Aquitaine, Western France, southern France, areas that still had strong moral sort of royalist scruples, and were not going to abide by the continued presence of the usurper. You could almost say in many ways this was Napoleon's attempt to get away from the whole cause of legitimism in France by making him less French and more German and more Italian. But in and of itself, he then engenders German and Italian nationalism, ultimately to the detriment of France as well.
Because there's so many things. If we keep the focus on the reason why I keep mentioning things. Oh, actually, this was good. This was something that was in France's interest. This thing here, this detail here or there, shows that Napoleon was good for France. I keep pointing those out because there's so many that aren't. So to sort of almost to play devil's advocate, point out a few where there are, because it seems like the ledger is so heavily weighted towards the fact that there wasn't. For example, you said just in passing there once, like the bloodshed and the human misery. And I feel like that was truly the first thing that popped into my mind when you said, why don't we talk about this? I immediately thought, well, a whole generation ruined, the amount of blood and human misery, the number of families ruined, that whole aspect of it, particularly for France. Surely that outweighs almost anything else. The Napoleonic Code, all sorts of things, that outweighs everything. Surely ruining a generation of Frenchmen, you must say then that Napoleon, if you have to come down on one side or the other, was not good for France. For me, that is still the biggest thing. So that although there are things we can point to, certainly there are some things you can point to that he did that are good for France. That one aspect alone.
I think it's a combination of factors. I mean, I haven't looked into the specifics as to whether I can really corroborate this, which is the argument that Napoleon's wars, and indeed the actual effects of the Code Napoleon, involving aspects like primogeniture, meant that it caused a demographic crisis in France that it never recovered from. Basically, France, at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, had a population which was larger than the Russian Empire. And then eventually Germany eclipses France in terms of population during the course of the 19th century, and that is key in terms of being able to understand the relative imbalance between the two nations ever since, is that demographic collapse. You can argue that. But
is that only after Bismarck unites them, though, surely?
The population of Germany was larger when Bismarck launched the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 than France at that point, but it was still disunited. But back to your point, it's justifying those deaths, effectively. And one can justify those deaths in saying that we were victorious. And
the French
were victorious. And it's the combination. It's the combination of death and defeat, which I believe makes the whole Napoleonic myth, again, it's so bizarre, and it can only basically come out of you can almost say a nationalistic bourgeois sense of ennui which envelops France during the 1830s and 40s, where everyone is bored with Louis Philippe and he brings Napoleon back. There is the burial of Napoleon in that preposterous marble ornate tomb in Les Invalides. And then you have the construction of the Arc de Triomphe, which wasn't built during Napoleon's time. He only constructed elements like the Arc de Carousel. But no, it's the fact that you combine all of these deaths and ultimately say, to what end? And what I find is ultimately so damning about Napoleon is that I am convinced that Napoleon believed all of these deaths were necessary for the sake of his star. In other words, I don't believe that despite all of Napoleon's grandiose affectations about salvation of the nation and all that he ever cared about the ordinary soldier. Right. And I think the most telling
so callous, though, isn't it? That's monstrous to me. But that is monstrous, isn't it?
But just think about, when we have his letters after his deposition, he basically has assumed a false martyrdom. The notion that to die defeated is to die every day. I have assumed a crown of thorns for the crown of France and the fate of my country. And it's just, you were given so many opportunities to ensure a peaceful resolution for France, but you could only opt for total victory or total defeat. There was no middle ground for you. You could say, for example, demonstrate military brilliance during the 6 Days Campaign in 1814, when you're reduced to only commanding about 40,000 men again, like you were during the Italian campaign days of the 1790s. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, because you have been able to create a political situation for yourself where you're now assailed by forces which are nearly 10 times your size, and it is all your fault. Again, another Napoleonic quotation. I think it was during the Battle of Leipzig. Yesterday, all of Europe marched with us. Today, all of Europe marches against us. Again, it's just the logic of, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that conquering over so much territory and putting your family members on all these thrones, it would form a part of a dynastic consolidation, wouldn't you? But it seems that this isn't consolidation at all. It's further establishing a precarious state of affairs from which one day everyone, including your most fervent allies like the Bavarians, decide to turn on you and join forces with the coalition. You know, one of the few countries that don't join against Napoleon, one is Saxony, and that's only because the French occupy Saxony during most of the campaigns of 1813. But Italy, and why doesn't Italy change hands? Because it is technically ruled over by Napoleon, who is also King of Italy, and it is ruled, in fact, by Eugene de Beauharnais, who is by far the most competent of all of Napoleon's relatives. Eugene de Beauharnais is the son of Josephine. So therefore, we can understand why that territory in particular, but everywhere else, including Sweden, under Jean Bernadotte, goes against Napoleon. And again, it's just, a lot of people can then use, okay, well, what does Napoleon represent? He's the triumph of will. Yeah, we go into Nietzschean arguments, you know. A lot of people have tried to extrapolate Nietzsche's interpretations of Napoleon and say, well, he was the manifestation of true freedom in terms of the death of ego, that Napoleon is all about the will triumphant and self-discipline, and he is the martial man, he is the Übermensch, he is the counter to slave morality. If anything, I believe is the opposite. I believe Napoleon was the slave to ambition,
right.
which is all the more obvious. And then you can get into the more sort of farcidaisical sort of arguments, like, for example, someone like Gabriele D'Annunzio, a Italian poet and soldier during the First World War, who later basically becomes, you can almost say, an antecedent towards someone like a Mussolini, goes out and says, you know, well, the Italian involvement in the First World War is a necessary baptism of fire. You know, we are basically going to soak our ledgers in blood, and it is going to be a glorious thing. In that sense, you know, France needs to come to its national culmination through glory, and glory inevitably means the shedding of blood. You can almost say, again, it's the perfect conversion of Christ. You know, I'm not going to, you know, shed myself and sacrifice myself for the sake of salvation of man. I'm going to compel the salvation of my nation through the blood of countless youths, effectively, which is what Napoleon's campaign ultimately amounts to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so you mentioned before his star, and that's not just like modern parlance. That's what he said. He talked about explicitly many times his star, that Josephine was one of the rays of his star, and all that sort of thing. And so he had this very clear idea about himself, about his ambition, about his place in history, and all that sort of thing. And earlier on, you also mentioned the idea that Talerand saw at a certain point, quite early on, the natural boundaries that France could have sat on, with the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees, and that should have been good enough. But then you've got Napoleon in his concept of his own star, and the fact that there's some sort of deep-seated lack of how would you say, of self-confidence about his own position, that he is a usurper, that he has to keep winning. Again, he said this explicitly, didn't he, in letters, that I have to keep winning battles. Like, if I stop winning battles, I can't just sit on my laurels, not forever. My power comes from going out and winning battles personally, and I have to keep doing it. So, like you're in this unstoppable war machine that cannot be stopped in some sense, or he doesn't want to stop it. He can't stop it.
I believe he could have stopped it, but like I said, it's his direct association. I mean, I think the quote again is in comparison to other European leaders. You know, when a European leader loses a war, it concerns the fate of a province or this and that. when I lose a war, it is always a fight for my very existence. But again, I don't believe that is necessarily the case. Europe during the Napoleonic Wars was mostly exhausted and fighting out of a sense of desperation. I mean, one of the remarkable things of the period during the Peace of Amiens with Britain is the fact that so many emigres and so many British tourists and traders used the opportunity to resume relations essentially again. So I believe that Napoleon's own inextricable political logic leads him down the path that military glory is me, and thereby, so long as I can associate France with political glory, then my own star is assured effectively. Basically ad astra, to the stars. I'm not sure whether this is an exact quote or not, but again, France will follow me to the moon if I give her another victory, that sort of thing. It's just, but again, glory, the whole notion of glory, it's post hoc, it's ephemeral, it's emotive, and I think so much of Napoleon's own sort of basis of power, I think, actually comes from the fact that he himself was an atheist. And so he is looking at this from a very, as I mentioned, that so much of the French Revolution is about conscious reenactment. When he is looking to, say, for example, the coronation, Napoleon's own coronation, it is always conscious reenactment. I'm going to recreate the original crown of Charlemagne. I am going to have the Pope bless me, not crown me, thereby surpassing Charlemagne, who he believed made a mistake in allowing the Pope to crown himself, and thereby he was in some way beholden to the Pope. I am going to have David, the great French painter, turn Notre Dame into a Greco-Roman pantheon, celebrating the rights of the nation, and I'm going to be at the center. And I'm going to paint my mother in the wings, even though she wasn't there, because she was not prepared to see the glorification of Josephine, who she considered, and quite rightly, to be a harlot. So that's so much of the essence of Napoleon. You can say it's Catholicism without God in so many ways. It is.
It's interesting.
It is the vestments. I need to wear that ridiculous get-up where I'm holding the scepter. I have my Napoleonic laurels, that grand imperial-style circular throne, and it is going to impress people. That's what so much of glory is, essentially. It's impressing upon people something which is metaphysical, but it's also unsubstantial. In the same way that, it's important to have French grenadiers dressed up in those tall hats and those epaulets, and make them feel, again, stronger and more powerful than they are. The uniforms themselves are basically giving, and again, the titles, the distinction. It's not enough basically to have a leveling effect of like how the communists treated the military in the 1920s and 1930s. Instead, we need to ostensibly imbibe the French political system with grandeur. And again, how can you credit that with anything else but compensating for this lack of legitimacy? I'm going to make a so-and-so prince of that, and so-and-so king of that, and so-and-so king of that. And, I have done so through my right of military victory again and again and again. And of course, as it was made, so it was so easily unmade.
So our question again, was Napoleon good for France? It does boil down to, doesn't it, when we can look at it with our God's eye view as the historian centuries later, the fact that ultimately he lost, the fact that ultimately the entire project was a complete failure. Surely then we can only come to the conclusion that he wasn't good for France. I mean, you could point to a few things, absolutely. I mean, like the Code Napoleon, it's obviously not as good as English common law, but still, surely that was better than what France had before. Things like this, you can point to that, and that was obviously in France's interest.
What does the Code Napoleon represent? It's the corollary to the continental system. I mean, I hate to sound, because my fear to people listening is that it's basically going to sound as if I have antipathy towards, Napoleon because I'm representing the position of Pitt or Liverpool. Basically, I'm just representing, little sort of England Britishness here. But no, I'm enamored of French culture. I love French history. am more invested and have greater expertise in French history than I do British history. I have examined, say, for example, someone extensively like a Louis XIV or a Charles de Gaulle. I can look at the Annales school and fall in love with a geographical approach to French history, the idea of the longue durée, the enduring systems and institutions of France. And I look at Napoleon and I see Napoleon as the antipathy to essentially everything that could have made France great. And I almost say to that sort of person, how can you be a French nationalist and not hate Napoleon for the heights he brought to you and for the devastation he also wrought? And it comes back to the question you point out about, obviously, the Code Napoleon is a good thing. Well, ostensibly, the Code Napoleon is a good thing because there's a standardization of French law and the abolition of seigneurial dues and seigneurial justice, which established different legal arenas for the nobility, the estates, versus the third estate, everyone else. But it's worse than that. It's the idea that we should have a political system built around systematization and harmonization. In other words, it's the precursor to the European Union. We have a political system which is inaccessible, stratified, no accountability in the form of the Commission. And the Commission is using various sort of political rubber stamps like the Parliament, the corps législatif in the case of Napoleon. And I'm going to push through laws which ensure that there is harmonization throughout all of the countries of Europe, irrespective of what their respective parliaments and political institutions want effectively. It is the origin of that, in the same way that the continental system is the imposition from on high of an integrated political and economic system, one that's based around antipathy towards Britain. You can say the modern continental system is sanctions against Russia. It's the same thing, it's the same logic.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that case, well, we're absolutely on the same page, essentially, that Napoleon was a disaster, ultimately for France. Would you say, I mean, even calling up issues with the Code Napoleon, would you say there is anything, or what are the things that pop into your mind that Napoleon did or achieved that were good for France? Do you think there's anything?
Well,
anything that endured, let's say?
Well, ironically, one of the most enduring things was the 1801 Concordat with the Catholic Church.
Okay.
It basically ensured...
He made his son king of Rome, didn't he, at some point?
Yes,
his
indeed.
Infant son.
After having deposed the Pope from Rome.
He did have contempt, really, didn't he, for Christianity?
He literally locked the Pope up.
Right.
He
I shouldn't laugh.
During I think it was during the Fifth Coalition War in 1809, he was in Vienna, having occupied the city, and he took it upon himself to declare that I have rescinded the donation of Pepin, which was this ancient legal guarantee by Charlemagne's father or grandfather to guarantee the temporal status of the Papal States. So I, as the new Charlemagne, the new Carolingian emperor, I'm going to dispossess the Pope, and I do so because I am the new Charlemagne. Who says so? I say so. And I'm going to lock him up. I'm going to exist excommunicate, effectively. But regardless of that, the legal structure of the 1801 Concordat existed until the Dreyfus affair and the imposed secularization of France in 1904, 1905, 1906. So that is one credible legacy. The Code Napoleon is obvious in terms of its endurance and legacy. The abolition of feudalism, which the French belief in feudalism as bad is axiomatic. In reality, feudalism in France had more or less effectively been terminated in any meaningful sense by the time we get to the French Revolution. Yeah. And so you can say that it became more of an ideological supposition that feudalism is bad and feudalism needs to be destroyed everywhere in Europe, rather than that having any sort of grandiose, tangible results. But again, one of the ironic effects, if you establish equality before the law, and you're also trying to establish a dynastic system of political power, you're basically also establishing the basis of, well, if everyone is supposed to be legally equal, why are you emperor of the French? And you're emperor of the French because you're a general and you command armies, effectively. Again, it's just pure might makes right. You can adorn it with all of this grandiose imperial splendor and all of these incredible paintings. There was one thing, again, which I was thinking about, that the constant wars meant that France was in many ways destitute during Napoleon's time. You know, you can look at during Napoleon's time, economically destitute. It was cut off, and Napoleon's solution to this was loot. In a way, he was some sort of Mongolian Khan, you know, going over, and I'm going to take the horses of Saint Mark, and I'm going to put them in the Louvre, which I have renamed the Musée Napoleon, because of course I have. You know, that is again a basis of Napoleon's necessity for further conquest. It's not just to expand France and to expand quote unquote ideas of the French Revolution, it's also to get rich by seizing the wealth and the property of other people effectively and subordinating them to France. So as a result of that, France doesn't have a great building program during the time of Napoleon, say, for example, comparable with Louis XIV, or even someone like a Catherine de' Medici, who was responsible for building the original Louvre. And so, ironically, people associate the building legacy of someone like a Louis Philippe and the Arc de Triomphe as Napoleon having built it, when in reality it was post hoc, like so much with the Napoleonic myth. It's we are distanced from the original memory of the devastation that wrought and the constant need for conscripts to churn into the Napoleonic meat grinder, that we can now look at the Napoleonic myth as something beautiful and wonderful, and chevaliers and cuirassiers, in Moscow and all that sort of thing. And again, another very telling quote regarding Napoleon: "I should have died in Moscow." It was almost as if by the end of his time as emperor, he had become, I think we all understand, he had become prematurely old through overexertion and through a series of injuries. Like Alexander the Great became prematurely old in his 30s. Napoleon was basically mentally and physically in his 60s when he was in his 40s. And the effect of this meant, you can almost say that Napoleon, like Alexander the Great, and his will to, say, for example, find the elusive sea corridor that would take him all the way back to Macedon, and to go back by finding basically the end of the world at the end of India, etc. Napoleon almost becomes a figure of tragic Greek dimensions. He becomes a Greek hero. There's nothing Christian about this at all. It becomes a tale of hubris. It's like, I may be wrong in this, but the Greek god Phaeton, who takes over the chariot of Helios, which causes the sun to go around the earth, and instead of riding it successfully, he crashes it into the land and creates the Sahara Desert as a result of that. So much so, in terms of aspiring to a star again, you talk about figures like Icarus, the man who flew too high, then burns, and then drops to the sea and dies. Really, if you look at Napoleon, it almost seems that his own conceit becomes something like an Icarus figure, like a figure of tragic Greek dimensions. But of course, as your hubris grows and as your delusion grows, inevitably your effectiveness as a political leader are going to be very conducive to that sort of mentality. In the same way that Ney, during the Battle of Waterloo, was determined to die during battle and had, I think, over a dozen horses shot from under him during the course of the battle, as if he had a death wish. And his dramatic charge against the British square formations, again, which was completely doomed. It seems that the later Napoleonic Empire has this horror of apocalyptic Greek proportions in the end. And that is not the sort of thing you want in a ruler who has the best interests of the people in mind, especially during the pivotal years of 1813, where you have a political advocate in the form of a Metternich. And again, who is ultimately tries to come to save France. It is the man who is bemoaned as this great nefarious betrayer and corrupt cripple, which is Talerand. Talerand is the one negotiating France's position in the concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna. And then, oh no, Napoleon's come back from Elba. Now all of my work has been undone and I'm going to have to cede more territories.
I really must do an epoch on Talerand. I've meant to for years, but I really must do that. So when we look at France post-Napoleon, I mean post 100 Days, he's in St. Helena, or he's dead. The rest of the 19th century, we've got the restoration of the Bourbons, right? But then that doesn't last all that long. And then we've got various republics. And even to this day, as you say, I mean, I think the French demographic was terribly, terribly wounded by World War One. But even before that, the Napoleonic era, you know, it's 100 years before, but still, on a demographic level, it wounded France, right? You would say. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that a generation of menfolk were sort of smashed, or very nearly, something like that. But do you think, and this is pure sort of alternative history, speculation stuff, but do you think, imagine the campaign of 1812 had been successful, so to say, and imagine Napoleon had lived to a fairly decent old age, and he'd kept, imagine eventually he was victorious in Spain and Portugal, and just imagine the whole project wasn't a failure, and he'd lived out his days like a Charlemagne. Would we then, do you think, would history, would people like us 200 years later say it was still, he was still basically a complete, a catastrophe for France? Despite still the millions of men that will have died, the millions of families that went through the misery and etc., etc. Do you think it's really mainly because that the whole project was a failure that we view him this way? Was the glory worth it, I suppose I'm asking?
To my answer, again, it's the fact that the failure was complete and the fact that the failure was avoidable is my issue. I mean, if we're going to go into alternative history, because it's an interesting question. Okay, what would a victory in Russia look like? You have the Tsar kowtowing to Napoleon and saying, please don't hurt me, I will do anything for you. Well, that wasn't going to happen because Russia had learnt its lesson by then and had created strategic depth. So what would a victory realistically look like in Russia? Had Napoleon, okay, victory would have looked like Napoleon not going as far as Borodino and deciding to carve off Western Russia and give it to Poland. That feasibly, to my mind, is the best he could have got, because the further the Grand Armée marches into Russia, the more devastation is wrought. People think about the retreat from Moscow. No, it was the march through the Pripyat marshes that killed more people than the exile from Moscow. So
should have never gone beyond Smolensk or something.
Well, you shouldn't even gone to Smolensk. Really, you shouldn't gone past Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Go that far. Don't go past Minsk. Consolidate a larger Poland, but you still have a hostile Russia that's not going to treat you any well. So,
or if we're in the realms of fantasy, imagine he'd followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, to Siberia, and eventually wiped him out. Just imagine somehow.
Well,
and somehow we'd beaten Wellington in Spain.
Well, like I said, I mean, it would have been predicated around what modern Europe is trying to do, which is the destruction of Russian civilization and Russian identity. And realistically, the only way Napoleon could have done that is by appeal to Swedish and Portuguese and Ottomans to seize all the territory that had been taken from them in the preceding century. But even then, that wouldn't have destroyed Russia. That would have simply made Russia relatively the same size of what she is today. Still formidable in the future. But ultimately, the idea would have been to give Napoleon enough time to construct a fleet or allow for the trade interdiction to bear fruits and force Britain to make peace. Again, that's another great question. Even if Napoleon had arrived in London, there's another tragic element to it, which is, as so much of the Napoleonic political system was built around harnessing all of Europe's might and severing British trade from the continent. Okay, let's assume Napoleon took over London. Then the reason for your empire existing has ceased to be. Your empire is simply there in fact and it has no enemies anymore. And of course, as we know, when an empire is basically left without a reason to exist, it can eventually lapse into complacency. And in the case of Napoleon, why I bring up the examples of German, British, and Italian and Spanish nationalism, so importantly, is the fact that even if you try to create a empire of Europe, which is ultimately the Napoleonic trajectory, the way Napoleon governed dictatorially, unilaterally, without consulting anyone, even members of his smaller, ever-growing smaller circle and his own family, the fact that he would be willing to demean his highest-ranking generals in front of their own men, thereby causing loss of morale and things like that, inevitably, I believe that Napoleon's empire would have collapsed after his death, given the tides of nationalism and given the whole impetus of the French Revolution. You will instead have a situation like we saw with Alexander. You might have local rulers, or you might have the marshals turning into the Diadochi, the successors.
Or after Charlemagne. I mean,
Exactly.
Louis, his own children deposed him and things, didn't they? Didn't last long after Charlemagne's death.
Yes, it was only 50 years after Charlemagne was made emperor that his empire began to collapse and divide. And even then, I think we would perhaps look at this and say that Napoleon was a great military conqueror in the same way that we, perhaps, again, we can look at him more like a Charlemagne figure. And there's a greater reverence to him, of course, by that extension. But ultimately, even then, his legacy for France, we still have to have various inverted question marks as to, how good that legacy would have been, a legacy of conquest. But like I said, what distances Napoleon from the beginning, at the beginning of the consulate versus late Empire Napoleon, is that the empire becomes less distinctly French, and France only becomes a component of that. Is it better to have a greater consolidated unitary monolingual France, or to have a Napoleonic empire in which France is lost? Again, it's so much so that France is only an aspect of Napoleon's ambitions because his ambition is limitless, effectively. In the same way that, one question which I think is interesting to consider, are we better off or worse off for having the British Empire, ultimately? In France, of course, the issue would have been more pronounced because they would have been all of France's neighbours. And so the reality of empire would have been even stronger to France than it is for us. So, yes, every way I look at it, I'm reminded of, all those derogatory, almost cartoonish, not just almost, literal cartoons of Napoleon. Boney the ogre, Boney the monster, and all that sort of thing. And I think in terms of someone who was a slave to his own ambition, in contrast to Nietzsche as being liberty as the death of ego, a man who was ego incarnate, I think there is something primordial and disturbing about that whole notion of that sort of man being able to assume total power without limitations. Because as I've described, Napoleon with limitations worked better when Napoleon had to cooperate and establish consensus, and he represented a clear backing from the French political class, and he was willing to negotiate with other European rulers. But Napoleon alone is something terrible to behold, as all Europe did in the 1810s.
Do you think it would have been ideal, what is it, after the War of the Second Coalition, would it be, or after the Peace of Amiens that you mentioned, after Marengo, or he's done the Northern Italy thing, he's entered Vienna, left Vienna, that period, if he could have somehow stopped there, I know he wouldn't have done, it wasn't in his, as we've said, it wasn't in his nature to sort of stop, in inverted commas, there, but if he could have stopped himself from further military conquests and started trying to play ball with the rest of the world.
Well, like
if he'd done that, do you think maybe then, his memory, his legacy, his place in history, and his ability to make France great again?
I think his legacy, to answer your question, I think his legacy, if that had happened, because it would have literally been a destabilizing republic. He comes in, wins one victory. His General Moreau also wins Hohenlinden, comes back, and uses Talerand to secure peace and alliances with all other European nations, then I don't continue to expand. I work within the bounds of international diplomacy, and I have to try a very delicate balancing act to ensure Britain doesn't feel threatened and thereby have the situation where Britain declared war in 1803, because that would have been a very difficult thing to achieve regardless, but Napoleon was the worst person to have for that. If that had been the case, Napoleon, I think, would have been looked on kind of like how monarchists and Catholics look at Francisco Franco.
Okay.
As in someone who comes in and restores order and peace, effectively. And I think...
A champion and a hero.
A champion and a hero.
And a nationalist could genuinely look up to him as a shining star.
Yes, I mean, in the same... Again, to look at my Franco comparison, people in Franco's instance were frustrated because Franco basically eliminated a political faction known as Carlism, which were the equivalent to like the Bourbon legitimist monarchists in France. And he also basically designated a junior prince, who was later Juan Carlos, to become his successor as King of Spain. So that didn't appease anyone, really. He was basically a general ruling as regent over Spain. Very similar to how Napoleon would have ruled as a conservative consul over France.
Yeah, so if Napoleon had stayed as simply first consul, he never went for the full-blown imperial crown.
Indeed, there could have been an opportunity to have a French prince succeed him at some point, when he died. Again, we're talking into hypotheticals, but I think counterfactuals are very important in understanding history, because when
it's fun, if nothing else.
Well, not just they're fun. You have to understand that people at various points in history are facing a series of possibilities ahead of them, and it is, I would say, stupid and deterministic to say that the things that happened are the only things that could have happened.
Of course.
But I think that Franco example, in terms of the consul Bonaparte, would have been a much better trajectory for France to follow on from than Boney the Ogre becoming, Emperor of Europe, which is ultimately the timeline that France went down, and him never having the self-awareness to realize that he was in many ways the author of his own destruction. Instead, he had to blame everyone for betraying him. Of course, if you're going to rule as a dictator, it's kind of like Henry II, who I know you've also covered, amassing all power to yourself. No wonder your younger sons, who expect a share in the feudal power, are going to rebel against you. Such is the logic of power. You have a weak starting point, and yet you assume that you can dictate to everyone, whether they be paupers or kings, as if they are simply soldiers in your army. No doubt you're going to have betrayals, as eventually everyone effectively did to Napoleon, except some, poor old sod like Caulaincourt.
It's interesting. I'm glad we're essentially of the same mind, that he is ultimately wasn't good for France. Any other sort of thoughts or any other big sort of themes that we haven't covered? Do you think is sort of, vitally important to the sort of our view of Napoleon?
I think, again, a lot of people, I think, will be frustrated with my view, because it seems to be an admonition against the great man, as in the notion that we should look to heroes.
But he wasn't that great, wasn't he? He died in prison. You can't be great if you die in prison, really, can you?
Well, I guess it's all about context, really. But even looking even looking at the whole notion of a great man. I mean, take Carlyle, for instance. The issue that Carlyle had with Napoleon was actually the issue which I'm praising him for, which is that he believed that Napoleon would have been a greater man had he been a pure embodiment of that Jacobin spirit, without the pseudo-political Catholic elements that I've been mentioning, essentially. In other words, had he been a pure spirit embodying a certain emancipated ideology, free from the constraints of historical context, and imposing that on Europe, in many ways, had he been more terrible, he would have been greater.
Had he been a Robespierre that was good at battles?
Yes, effectively. That would have been, the Carlylean great man, because then in a historical sense, we can basically say that Napoleon determined history in that sense. But really, I mean, if you look at ideologically the way Napoleon determined history, the Napoleon on horseback, the revolution on horseback, it seems that again he was the after effects of what had actually occurred in the French Revolution, and Europe basically had to deal with that legacy when he ultimately went. And they resorted to something called, monarchy of the right, i.e. restoration of something akin to divine right of kings after he had gone. But of course, ultimately what I believe to be the failure of that system is that nationalism was such a potent force by now because of Napoleon. And sometimes it seems that the Austrians and the Prussians were prepared to lean on the forces of nationalism to get what they wanted.
In their own
ways,
yeah.
in their own spheres. But Metternich was deluded, really, to think that he could gloss over that through a regime of strict monitoring and censorship, effectively. So, and also, again, another legacy of Napoleon is this schizophrenic French identity, which is lurching towards Catholic, conservative monarchist and Robespierrean republican. And I think if you look at Napoleon again, his failure ensured that split within France, that schizophrenic identity. And it required someone like a de Gaulle, which you can say ultimately had a much worse starting point than Napoleon, working off 1940 after France's capitulation at the Peace of Compiègne. De Gaulle, the whole project of his Fifth Republic was to reconcile the French left to, you can almost say, bourgeois capitalism and the French society as then constituted, and to reconcile Action Française and the monarchists to the notion of the Republic. And in many senses, I would say up until now, de Gaulle was successful in that. He created a system that didn't really inspire the hearts of anyone, but ultimately they rounded around the notion of this is France. And it may not be the ideal political situation. De Gaulle, by inclination and by education, by his own dynastic family history, was a monarchist, a Catholic legitimist, and yet he's the one who's reconciling the whole Republican identity for the right in France. In the case of Napoleon, like I said, what do you have? Because of the whole nature of his rule and the total failure of it, it leads to this schizophrenic identity that de Gaulle basically has to plaster over with this facsimile of the Fifth Republic, which, as we see with all French political systems, even that now is dying. Whereas Napoleon, as a Franco figure, could have perhaps again ultimately reconciled the worst excesses of the French Revolution, and you can say the left's phobias about the elements of the ancien regime, etc. So Napoleon had so many opportunities that other figures in less advantageous positions were able to manipulate better, like a de Gaulle. That's why I say, for example, I can look at de Gaulle and have so much admiration for him, and look at Napoleon and say you're basically someone who screwed up so many opportunities that were given to you. And ironically, they come from a very similar position intellectually, or sort of a form of grandiose egotistical posturing. I've compared de Gaulle, for example, to the anti-hero of Crime and Punishment, partly because the whole basis of Crime and Punishment is that you justify the crime given that you are endowed with a greater intellect or abilities that allow you to supersede the laws of men, effectively. That's Napoleon, as so much as it is de Gaulle also. What right did de Gaulle have in 1940 as a junior Minister of Defence to declare that he was the voice of the French people when the legally constituted government was a Vichy? But he managed, and he turned that position into something of almost perpetual veneration. General Charles de Gaulle as the first president of the Fifth Republic, whereas Napoleon has achieved the opposite.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, we should draw it to an end there, but there's so much more that could be said. I mean, this sort of conversation could go on and on and on and on. It's great. I mean, just to finish off, just to say one more thing. The point you've made a number of times here is that Napoleon had so many opportunities that it seems that just he personally, just a personal decision purely born out of his own mind, was the wrong thing. It was just the wrong thing to do. but not just even the big ones, like the decision to march into Russia in 1812, or the decision not to accept some sort of Austrian brokered peace afterwards, or to depose the Spanish monarchy in the way he did, or the decision to try and invade Portugal at all. Or there's just some of the big obvious ones, but there, when you look at in detail at Napoleon's career and life, he does it all. He seems to do it all the time, kind of all the time. Again, in hindsight, you look, you think, oh, that wasn't a good idea. That wasn't going to bode well. And sort of, not just a hindsight thing, but how did you not see it at the time? It's kind of obvious that was a flawed idea. So I suppose we've sort of we've made that point enough. But yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Was there anything else at all?
No, just to emphasize your point that these aren't a few isolated examples that you can point to, a great what ifs. No, this is granular. This is the whole basis of the Napoleonic system. It entails this sort of doom-driven logic, effectively. So you can look at it as a Greek tragedy, and I hate to use historical determinism, but like I said, it's the basis of the usurpation seems to engender this sort of willingness to continually usurp and usurp and usurp and depose and reorient the whole political system in Europe until you yourself have created forces which are so inexorable that you yourself are ultimately deposed.
Yeah, the hubris. That's the perfect word, isn't it, really? The hubris. Okay, if you let people know about your channel, I'm sure most people watching this are already aware, but just give you an opportunity to mention it.
Just Apostolic Majesty on YouTube. I have a eclectic range of various topics, a lot of modern history, but a lot of medieval history. So other than that, just thank you again, Beau and the Lotus Eaters, for having me on. It's been a wonderful time and a very important topic, I think, in terms of just understanding the whole nature of the French Revolution and Napoleon and the whole nature of power during that time. I think it's an important discussion to have, especially as we're recording this on Bastille Day.
No, thank you. Thank you for your time, and we're honoured to do your face reveal, essentially. So, okay, I hope you all enjoyed that out there. Hopefully we'll get AM back sometime soon. Oh, I really do genuinely enjoy chatting with you whenever we can. So let us know in the comments your thoughts and feelings, and until next time, take care.